The sun was still climbing when he started his ride. The road was dry, long and silent, except for the steady rhythm of hooves striking the dirt. Dust followed him like a ghost, hanging in the air behind his black horse. His coat was old, his face rough, and his eyes cold and unreadable. He didn't ride for adventure. He rode for business. In his saddlebag, a folded paper carried the weight of another man's fate. A deed stamped and signed declaring land to be taken. To him, it was just another job. Someone failed to pay. Someone else would collect. Simple, clean, without emotion. He told himself that was all it was. The land ahead stretched for miles, fences leaning under the sun, fields browned by hunger for rain. The world here had grown quiet, forgotten by the cities. But the rider liked it that way. The silence made things easier. It left no room for doubt. He kept his eyes on the horizon where the faint shape of a farmhouse shimmered through the heat. That was his destination. A piece of land once promised to a man who couldn't keep it. A man who had worked too hard and gained too little. The rider didn't think much about him. He had seen too many of the same kind. Faces drawn, backs bent, eyes begging for mercy that never came. He wasn't cruel, not exactly. But mercy didn't feed him. Mercy didn't pay debts. The world had taught him that long ago. He'd learned that pity was a luxury for people who didn't have to survive. He adjusted his hat against the glare. The horse snorted, uneasy, sensing something he didn't. Maybe it was the stillness in the air. Maybe it was the feeling that somewhere ahead, someone was waiting with fear instead of welcome. He brushed the thought aside. Every man had his duty, and this was his. The land wasn't his problem. The people weren't his concern. He'd take what the paper said he could and move on before nightfall. But as the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a woman's voice in the distance, something in him stirred. It wasn't enough to stop him yet, but it was enough to make him wonder, for the first time in years, what waited at the end of this ride. The sun burned slow across the sky, pouring light over the fields that had once been green and alive. The land stretched wide, quiet, heavy with the weight of years. The fences leaned from age, the barn roof sagged a little lower each season, and the wind carried dust instead of the smell of crops. Yet to the old man, this land was still alive. Every corner, every stone, every crack in the soil carried a memory that only he could see. He stood by the gate with his weathered hands resting on the wood, eyes squinting against the glare. His back curved from years of labor, and the sun had drawn deep lines into his skin. To most, it looked like he owned nothing but a dying piece of earth. But to him, it was his history, his wife's laughter echoing in the fields, his daughter's first steps on the porch, the sound of rain hitting the tin roof after months of drought. He had built this land from nothing. He had fought against storms, hunger, and men with sharper tongues than knives. But now, his strength had faded. The debts had grown, and the world no longer cared for men who worked with their hands. The land he had poured his life into was now something he could lose with the stroke of a pen. Behind him, the old house stood tired and thin. The paint had long peeled away. The front door creaked every time the wind pushed against it. Inside, his daughter moved quietly, sweeping dust that would only return tomorrow. Her hair, tied back with a simple cloth, glowed faintly in the sunlight that cut through the window. She hummed a tune under her breath, something her mother used to sing, though her voice trembled when she tried to finish the song. She looked out the window and saw her father still standing by the gate, motionless. He had been there for nearly an hour, staring down the road that led to nowhere. A road she feared would soon bring a stranger. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. She already knew. The letters had come weeks ago. Words written by men from town who never once walked this land, yet somehow claimed the right to take it. She stepped outside, her bare feet pressing against the dry earth. The air was hot and thick. "Pa," she said softly, but he didn't turn. "Come inside, you need rest." He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the distance. "Rest don't change nothin'," he said. His voice was rough, tired, but steady. "Man's gotta face what's common, no matter how late it arrives." She walked closer, her small frame beside his tall shadow. Maybe there's still a way, she said. Maybe they'll listen. Men who come to take don't come to listen. He sighed, rubbing his temples with his calloused fingers. It's done, girl. The land's theirs by law now. Ain't no sense in begging. But it's ours, she whispered. You built it, you. He turned to her then, his eyes soft but firm. I built it, yes. But I built it in a world that don't care who builds what. All that matters now is whose name sits on a paper. She looked away, biting her lip, fighting the tears that pressed against her chest. He had always been strong, unbreakable. To see him speak like this felt wrong, like watching a mountain crumble. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of smoke from somewhere far off. The father's gaze followed it, knowing it meant someone was near. He'll be here soon, he said. The man they sent. Her heart clenched. She had imagined this day again and again, but each time she hoped something would change. Maybe the debt would disappear, maybe the letter had been a mistake, maybe fate would be kind for once. But fate had never been kind to their kind. She turned to look at the fields, stretching toward the horizon. This was more than land, it was her whole life. Every morning she'd woken up to the sight of it, every evening she'd watched the sun fall over it. She could feel the pulse of it, the way her father did. And the thought of someone else claiming it made her chest ache. Pa, she said, her voice shaking. You can't just let him take it. There has to be something we can do. He smiled faintly, but the smile held sorrow more than comfort. There's nothing left to trade, nothing left to offer. All I've got left is you, and that's one thing I'll never put on the table. She felt the sting of his words, not because they were harsh, but because they carried truth. He would rather lose everything than see her hurt. Yet deep down, she knew she couldn't stand by and watch him lose everything he had built. Not while she could still stand, still speak, still fight. Inside, the house groaned with the weight of the wind. The clock on the wall ticked slow, like it, too, was waiting for the inevitable. The animals in the barn were restless, sensing change in the air. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over the property that day. The daughter went back inside, her fingers brushing across the old wooden table. She traced the grooves her father had carved years ago. She thought of her mother's hands kneading dough there, her laughter filling the room. The silence now felt too heavy, too final. She looked at the window again and saw her father still by the gate. The horizon shimmered with heat, but beneath it a figure was slowly forming, small, dark, distant, but moving closer. Her breath caught. Pa, she called, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, only nodded once as if he already knew. The figure grew larger, a man on horseback. The dust behind him rose like smoke from a fire. The daughter's hands clenched. She could feel her pulse in her throat. The man who would decide their fate was nearly here. She turned toward her father. His shoulders were straight, his face calm, but his eyes, those eyes carried the weight of everything he had ever lost and everything he was about to. And as the rider came closer, the daughter made a silent promise in her heart. She wouldn't let the land go, not while she could still breathe, not while she could still stand between that rider and her father. The sound of hooves grew louder. The dust curled into the air like smoke before a storm, and the old man whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "So it begins." Inside the small house, the light had softened. The afternoon sun slipped through the curtains in quiet, golden lines, landing across the floorboards worn smooth by years of footsteps. The girl stood by the window, still as a shadow, her hands clasped together. She could hear her father outside, the slow creak of the gate, the crunch of his boots in the dirt. Every sound felt sharper now, heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. She had always been her father's strength in silence. When the crops failed, she was the one who smiled and said they would try again. When the roof leaked in the storm, she held the lantern as he worked through the night. She had never asked for much, just to keep what little they had, the land that carried her mother's memory, the house that still smelled faintly of smoke and bread. But life had a cruel way of testing even the purest hearts. Her mother used to say, "A person's worth isn't measured by what they own, but what they protect." Those words had stayed with her, buried deep. Now, as the sound of hooves drew closer down the empty road, Those words burned like fire in her chest. She turned from the window and looked at the table where the letter still lay. The ink had faded at the edges, but the meaning was as sharp as ever: payment overdue, land to be claimed, settlement final. She had read it more times than she wanted to admit, searching for some hidden mercy in the words, but there was none. Just law, cold and simple. Her eyes shifted to the wall where an old rifle hung. It had belonged to her grandfather, untouched for years. She stared at it for a long moment. Not out of violence, but out of fear, fear of what it might mean to use it. She wasn't her father. She didn't believe in pride before peace. She believed in mercy, in reason, in finding another way. The hooves grew louder. She could almost feel the vibration through the floor. The sound rolled through the stillness of the house, shaking something deep inside her. She stepped outside. The light hit her face, warm and blinding. Her father was still by the gate, unmoving. The rider was closer now, a tall figure on a dark horse, hat low, dust swirling around him like smoke. For a second the world felt smaller. Just her father, the land, and the man who had come to take it. "Go inside," her father said quietly. "This ain't for you." But she didn't move. "It is for me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's for both of us." He looked at her, his face a mix of love and worry. "You don't understand, girl. There's nothing to be done. You can't change a man who's come to collect." "Then let me try," she said. "If he's come to take, maybe he can still be asked to spare." Her father opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. Maybe he saw something in her eyes, that same spark her mother used to carry, the one that refused to bow even when the world turned cruel. The horse stopped at the gate. The rider sat tall, his face half hidden by shadow. He looked at the old man first, then at her. His eyes lingered, studying her calm but defiant stance. There was no fear in her gaze, only quiet strength. "Afternoon," the rider said. His voice was deep, even. "Name's Colt Avery. I was sent from town." The father nodded once. "I know why you're here." "Good," the rider replied. "Then you know what needs to be done." He reached for the paper in his coat pocket, but before he could unfold it, the girl stepped forward. "Sir," she said quickly, her voice trembling but clear, "please, before anything's decided, let me speak." Colt paused, surprised. "This between me and your father, miss." "It's between all of us," she said. "Because what you're taking, it's not just land. It's a man's life. It's the place where my mother's buried, the place where every good thing we've known still breathes." The rider studied her. He had heard pleas before: anger, desperation, threats. But this one was different. There was no begging in her tone. Just truth, spoken softly, as if she were trying to remind him of something he had forgotten long ago. Her father lowered his head. "Girl, don't," she turned to him, her voice breaking. "I can't just stand here, Pa. I can't watch everything you built disappear." She faced the rider again. "You came to take, I know. But if it's my father's life or his land you want, then take me instead. Just spare him." The air seemed to stop moving. The wind fell silent, even the horse's breath grew still. Colt's expression shifted, not anger, not pity, but confusion. "What did you say?" She took another step closer. Her hands shook, but her words didn't. "You heard me. You can take whatever you think is fair, my work, my time, my freedom, just not him. Please." For a long moment, no one spoke. The rider looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a farmer's daughter, but as something else, something unbreakable. Her eyes shone in the fading light, not with tears, but with defiance and love bound tightly together. Her father took her hand, his rough fingers trembling. "You don't know what you're saying." She squeezed back. "I do. You've given your whole life for this land. Pa, let me give something too." The rider dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the dust. He took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked at the two of them, the broken man and the girl, standing like a shield before him. Something stirred behind his calm face. He had come ready to claim what was written on paper. But this was something no law had prepared him for. He looked at the girl again, the way her shoulders straightened even as fear crept into her eyes. "You'd really do that?" he asked quietly. She nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just spare him." And in that still moment, the sound of the world returned, the creak of the windmill, the rustle of the dry grass, the beating of three hearts waiting for what came next. The writer's fingers tightened around the deed. He looked down at it, then back at her. The ink, the signature, the seal, all of it suddenly felt smaller than the moment in front of him. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, caught between what he came to do and what her words had already undone inside him. The wind had shifted by the time the rider stepped closer to the gate. The sky had turned pale, the kind of fading light that comes just before evening, when everything looks softer but feels heavier. Dust swirled in the air, wrapping around the three of them, the old man, the girl, and the stranger who carried the power to change their lives. Colt Avery stood still, hat in hand, his boots planted in the dirt. He looked from the father's weary face to the girl's trembling hands, still clenched at her sides. Her offer hung in the air, a whisper that refused to fade. He had expected anger, maybe tears, maybe silence, but not this. Not a girl offering herself in exchange for her father's peace. The father's voice broke the silence first. "You've said enough, child." He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the rider. "You think you're helpin', but this ain't your burden. Ain't no man worth traddin' your life for." She shook her head, tears forming but not falling. "Pa, please." "No," he said sharply, though his voice trembled beneath the weight of it. "You go inside." Colt watched the two of them, something twisting inside him. He had seen many scenes like this, men clinging to what was theirs, families torn apart by debts they couldn't pay. But this was different. There was something sacred about the way she stood there, about the way she refused to let her father carry the fall alone. He cleared his throat, trying to steady the air around him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you don't know what you're saying. This isn't about talking lives, it's about settling what's owed." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "And what's owed that a man can't pay with his own hands?" she asked. "You think paper can measure a lifetime of work, of love? My father gave everything to this land. If there's a debt left, let me carry it." Colt opened his mouth, but the words caught. He'd been trained to follow orders, to collect, to sign and ride on. That's what kept the world turning, or so he'd believed. But now, standing here, that belief felt small. Her voice cracked something open in him that had long been sealed. He looked at the father. "You knew this day was common." The old man nodded slowly. "I knew, but I didn't think it'd come like this." Colt unfolded the deed in his hand. The paper fluttered in the wind, edges browned from sun and dust. He read the words again, even though he knew them by heart. The ink spoke of property, interest, signatures. None of it spoke of the people who lived here. None of it spoke of the love that built these walls. The girl took another step forward. Her bare feet brushed against the dry grass, her voice softer now. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know you think you're just doing your job, but jobs don't have to take hearts with them." He looked at her then, really looked. She was young, but her eyes carried years he couldn't name. Strength lived there, but so did pain. He felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that made him uneasy. "Miss," he said quietly, "you don't understand the kind of world we live in." "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me what kind of world asks a man to take another man's home just because ink says so. Tell me what kind of world looks at someone like you and says you can't choose mercy." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Mercy. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him about mercy. Once, he'd believed in it. Once, he'd been the kind of man who could say no, who could walk away from a deal that didn't feel right. But years on the road, years collecting what others had lost, had turned him into something colder. The father finally spoke again, voice low but steady. "She's got a heart too big for this world. Don't listen to her, mister. Take what you came for and go. I won't stop you." Colt stared at him. "You just let it happen." "What choice do I have?" the father asked, almost a whisper. "You think the law cares about a man like me? They'll send someone else if not you, maybe worse. Least if you take it, you'll leave her safe." The girl's voice broke through his words. "Safe," she said, her tone trembling with disbelief. "There's no safety in loss in everything you love." For a moment, none of them spoke. The sky had turned deeper now, streaked with red and gold. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to break the spell. Colt folded the paper again, slower this time. His hand shook slightly. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "I thought I'd stopped feeling anything a long time ago. Thought I'd learned how to look a man in the eye and not care what I saw." He looked up at her. "You just ruined that." Her lips parted, unsure how to respond. He glanced back at his horse, then at the land. "This place," he said, "it's got life still. I can feel it. Ain't right to take it from the ones who bled for it." The father frowned, not daring to hope. "You talkin' like you mean to leave it be." Colt didn't answer right away. He walked closer to the fence, his boots crunching on dry earth. He ran a hand over one of the posts, rough and splintered. He thought about his own father, long gone, a man who once told him, "Don't ever forget that soil remembers who walks it." He turned back to them. The girl was watching him, her breath shallow, her hands trembling in front of her. "You think your words don't matter," he said softly, "but they do. You've made me remember something I thought I'd buried." Her eyes glistened, the first tear slipping down her cheek. Colt looked down at the paper one last time, then tore it clean in half. The sound of it ripped through the stillness like thunder. The father flinched. The girl gasped. The wind caught the torn pieces and carried them away, scattering them across the field until they disappeared into the horizon. Colt put his hat back on, his voice low. "I didn't come here to steal a man's soul." He turned toward his horse, but before mounting, he looked back at her. The words came quiet, rough, almost like a confession. "No one's ever spoken to me like that before." She didn't answer. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling, her heart still racing with fear and disbelief. Colt mounted his horse, gave her one last look, then tipped his hat. The sky had dimmed, and the first stars began to show. And for the first time in his life, the man who rode to take walked away with nothing but a whisper that would follow him for the rest of his days. The dust had not yet settled when the rider disappeared beyond the ridge. The girl stood frozen, her breath uneven, watching until the last shadow of his horse melted into the horizon. The torn pieces of the deed still drifted in the wind, dancing like pale leaves across the fading light. She didn't move. She couldn't. Everything that had just happened felt too unreal, too heavy to understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a question she couldn't answer. Her father was the first to break the silence. He let out a long breath, one that seemed to carry years of worry out of his body. His shoulders sank and his eyes, tired but still alive, looked toward her. "Girl," he whispered, voice rough and uncertain, "what did you just do?" She turned slowly, still staring down the empty road. "I don't know," she said softly. "I just couldn't let him take it." He took a step toward her, his boots crunching over the dry earth. "You could have been hurt. You don't talk to men like that, not men who come with paper and orders." She shook her head. "He wasn't what I thought he'd be. He looked like someone who'd seen too much of the world, someone who'd forgotten what it means to feel. I think maybe he remembered." The old man didn't reply. His eyes followed the same road, searching the horizon for something he couldn't name. The air felt strange now, lighter, but trembling with the weight of what had passed. He'd been ready to lose everything that day. But now, standing beside his daughter, he realized he hadn't just kept the land. He'd kept something even more fragile, hope. They walked back toward the house in silence. The porch creaked beneath their feet. The girl sat on the steps, staring at the field stretching before them. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in a bruised orange glow. The earth smelled of dust and faint traces of life. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again, though the breath trembled in her chest. Her father leaned against the railing. "When your mother was alive," he said quietly, "she used to say some hearts are born to break rules made by other men. Guess she was talking about you." She smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the distance. "I didn't break a rule, Pa, I just reminded him we're still people." He nodded, his lips pressed together, as if afraid that speaking might break the fragile peace that had just settled between them. The sound of the windmill creaking filled the silence, steady and slow. The land seemed different now, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. Out on the road, Colt Avery rode without direction. The reins hung loose in his hand, and his horse moved at an easy pace, as if it too sensed that the journey ahead had lost its purpose. He could still hear her voice, soft, pleading, but strong enough to cut through the armor he had built over years of doing what he thought was right. Just spare him, 3 words. That was all it took to undo him. He rode until the sun began to sink behind the hills. The sky turned red, then violet. Shadows stretched long across the open land. He stopped by a creek, letting his horse drink, while he stared at his reflection in the water. For the first time in a long time, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He had built his life on doing his duty, on keeping his hands clean of emotion. He told himself that fairness was his compass, that if the law said something belonged to one man, then that was how it should be. But tonight, the weight of that belief felt wrong. For years, he had thought himself strong for not caring. Now, he felt something close to shame for how easy it had been. He closed his eyes and heard her again, the steadiness in her voice, the tremor in her breath when she stepped between him and her father. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever looked at him as if there was still good left to be found. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small corner of the deed that hadn't been caught by the wind. It was torn, stained, and useless now. He stared at it for a long while, then dropped it into the creek. The paper floated for a moment before sinking beneath the surface and vanishing completely. When he looked up, the stars were beginning to appear, scattered faintly across the wide sky. The sound of frogs began to hum from the water's edge. The world seemed quieter, kinder, even if just for a moment. Back at the farmhouse, the girl sat with her father by the window. A single lamp burned on the table, its flame small but steady. She traced her fingers along the old wood, feeling the grooves carved there by her father's hands. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, filled with everything words didn't need to say. She thought about the man on the horse, the coldness in his eyes when he arrived, and the way that cold had melted when she spoke. She didn't know where he came from or what kind of life had shaped him, but she knew one thing. He hadn't left as the same man who arrived. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "You think he'll be back?" She hesitated, her gaze on the horizon where the stars shimmered just above the line of the fields. "Maybe," she said, "but if he does, I don't think he'll come to take anything." The old man smiled faintly. "No, I reckon he already did." She looked at him, puzzled. He nodded toward her chest. "He took something from you, girl, a piece of that fierce heart of yours. The kind of thing a man remembers when the world turns cold again." She looked down, a faint warmth rising to her cheeks. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because deep inside she already knew it was true. Out there on the road, Colt stopped for a moment and looked back. The farmhouse was barely visible, a faint shape under the darkening sky. But he could still see it, glowing like a small ember against the vast emptiness. He tipped his hat in its direction, not out of farewell but respect. Something inside him had changed, something quiet but unshakable. He had come to take a man's land. Instead, he'd been given a reminder of what mercy felt like, what it meant to see people as more than debts and signatures. He turned his horse toward the open plain. The wind brushed against his face, cool and gentle. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel empty. It felt alive. And as he rode into the growing night, her voice followed him, soft, steady, unforgettable, echoing through the silence of his heart. Morning came softly. The sky stretched wide and clear, washed clean by the cool breath of dawn. The light moved across the land slowly, touching the tops of the fields, the broken fence posts, the roof of the old house that still stood firm through another night. The girl woke early, long before the rooster crowed. Sleep hadn't come easy. Her dreams were filled with the sound of hooves fading into the dark, and the echo of that torn paper twisting in the wind. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her father, and stepped outside barefoot into the pale gold of morning. The air was different today. The kind of calm that comes after a storm, not loud, not full of fear, but still heavy with change. She walked down the porch steps and stood at the edge of the field. The earth smelled fresh, carrying a promise she couldn't name. Somewhere out there, the rider was still moving, and though she didn't know where, she felt the trace of his presence linger in the soil, like a memory the land refused to let go of. Her father joined her a few minutes later, leaning against the post with his hat pulled low. His hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee, steam curling in the chill air. "You're up early," he said. She smiled faintly. "Didn't really sleep," he nodded. "Neither did I." He looked out at the field, squinting against the rising sun. "Looks different, don't it?" She followed his gaze. The same dry grass, the same cracked soil, but somehow, yes, it did look different. Maybe it was just the light, or maybe something deeper had shifted. The weight that had hung over the land for so long seemed to have lifted. "Feels lighter," she said softly. He took a slow sip, the warmth steadying his old hands. "Guess Mercy has a way of changing the air." She didn't answer. Instead, she knelt and pressed her fingers into the soil, feeling its coolness. Beneath the surface, life was still waiting, patient and quiet. It reminded her that even the hardest ground could hold hope if you gave it enough time. The wind rustled through the fence line, carrying the sound of birds returning. The world was waking again. For the first time in months, she felt that the land still belonged to them, not by paper or law but by spirit. They had survived the taking. As the day unfolded, she went about her chores as she always did, feeding the chickens, fetching water, mending a tear in her dress. The rhythm of it all felt both ordinary and sacred, like every motion was a prayer for the life they'd almost lost. Her father fixed the fence by the road, humming an old tune under his breath. The one her mother used to sing. It had been a long time since he'd hummed anything at all. When the sun climbed higher, she found herself looking toward the horizon again, searching for a dark figure against the light. She told herself it was foolish, that men like him didn't come back. But still her eyes wandered. Not out of longing but curiosity, wondering if he'd kept going, wondering if he'd remembered. Miles away, Colt rode slow through a canyon of red stone, his horse's hooves echoing against the narrow walls. The world was quiet except for the wind and the sound of the reins creaking in his hands. He hadn't spoken to another soul since leaving the farm. He hadn't needed to. The silence was enough. He thought about the girl, the fire in her voice, the look in her eyes when she said those words. He'd seen many kinds of courage before, but none like hers. It wasn't loud or proud. It was born of love. A kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself, only to protect what it can. He'd told himself he wouldn't turn back. But as the day wore on, the thought of that small house, the old man and the girl who stood between them and the world began to pull at him. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something gentler, something close to gratitude. She had reminded him that even men who'd gone too far could still change their path. By evening, he stopped at a trading post, a small wooden building perched beside the trail. Inside, he bought a few supplies, flour, coffee, nails, and as he reached for his coins, his hand brushed against something in his coat pocket. It was a small, broken button. He didn't remember picking it up, but he knew where it had come from. The girl's dress. It must have torn when she stepped toward him, standing between him and her father. He turned the button over in his palm, feeling its smooth edge. A small thing, almost nothing. Yet somehow it carried the weight of that moment more than words ever could. The shopkeeper's voice broke his thoughts. "You headin' north, mister?" Colt looked up. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." He left a few coins on the counter and walked outside. The air was cooling now, the first stars faint against the darkening sky. He mounted his horse, turning it east, toward the plains, toward the place he thought he'd left behind. Back on the farm, night fell gentle and slow. The girl sat on the porch again, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Fireflies blinked across the field, tiny sparks floating in the dark. She could hear her father inside, his steady breathing a comfort. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet. It felt full, not empty, like the earth itself was resting after a long fight. Then somewhere far off she heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of hooves. Slow, careful, familiar. Her heart skipped. She opened her eyes, scanning the road that led to the gate. A dark figure appeared, small at first, then clearer under the moonlight. The rider stopped at the edge of the fence. He didn't move closer, didn't speak. Just sat there, hat low, horse breathing softly. She rose, stepping forward a few paces, her bare feet brushing the cool grass. The night air carried the scent of rain and dust. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he tipped his hat, a small gesture, but it said everything. She smiled, faint and soft. "You came back," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. The wind carried across the field, tugging at her hair, stirring the quiet between them. The stars burned brighter now, their light falling over the land that had nearly been lost, and the people who refused to let it go. Somewhere deep in that silence, the whisper still lived, echoing through both their hearts. 3 words that had changed everything. 3 words that neither time nor distance could erase. Just spare him.